At 263 pounds, Adèle Prudhomme had learned to move fast and disappear faster. That was the unspoken rule of the job. Keep your head down. Clear the plates before the guest notices you. Refill the water glass without making eye contact. In a hotel like the Château Frontenac, where the chandeliers cost more than her mother's entire apartment building in Verdun, women like Adèle were designed to be invisible, background noise, human furniture. She'd been working banquet service for 4 years, ever since she dropped out of Concordia in her second year when the tuition money ran dry and her stepfather's promises turned out to be exactly what she'd always suspected. Air. She wasn't bitter about it. Not exactly. She'd filed those feelings somewhere behind her sternum, in the same drawer where she kept her father's old letters and the acceptance notice from the nursing program she'd deferred indefinitely. There wasn't time for bitter when you had a 9-hour shift ahead of you and 47 place settings to lay before 7 o'clock. It was the 3rd Thursday of November, the kind of Quebec City evening where the wind off the St. Lawrence cuts straight through your coat and reminds you the river doesn't care about you at all. The Versailles Ballroom had been booked for a private event. No name on the internal system. Just a reservation code and a handwritten note from the hotel manager that said, in his careful cursive, maximum discretion. Floor staff rotates every 90 minutes, no photographs. That alone told Adèle everything she needed to know about who was coming. She'd been in banquet service long enough to read notes the way a ship captain reads weather. Maximum discretion meant the guest was either a politician, a celebrity, or someone whose name you weren't supposed to Google. The no photographs note narrowed it significantly. Her co-worker, Tanya, had grabbed her arm in the service corridor 20 minutes before doors opened. Did you see the security sweep? They had dogs, Adèle. Dogs, I saw. They checked the flower arrangements. I know, Adèle had just looked at her. The kind of person we don't ask questions about. Tanya had gone pale and found something urgent to do on the other side of the room. The guests arrived the way powerful people always arrived, not all at once, but in a sequence that communicated hierarchy, without anyone saying a word. First the outer ring, men in dark suits who stood near the exits and held their jackets slightly open on the left side. Then the inner circle, sharper dressed, quieter, moving with the particular kind of stillness that comes from discipline rather than ease, and then, finally, the center of it all. Adèle was arranging the last of the bread rolls at table 3 when the room pressure changed. That was the only way she could describe it later. The air shifted. Conversations dropped by half a volume, not silent, not dramatic, just recalibrated. The way a room full of birds goes quiet when something larger moves through the trees. Sébastien Duval walked in at 7:14. She knew the name because she'd heard it exactly twice in her life. Once from her uncle, who'd driven long-haul trucks out of Montreal for 20 years and come home one night with a particular expression she'd never seen on him before, and once from the news, obliquely, in a segment about organized crime in the Lower St. Lawrence region that the reporter had handled with the careful language of someone who understood exactly how much they could say. The segment had lasted 3 minutes and 20 seconds and had not included a photograph. He was taller than she'd imagined, or maybe it was the way he carried himself. Straight-backed, unhurried, with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of other people, adjusting themselves around him rather than the other way around. Somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been formed specifically to deliver bad news. He wore a charcoal suit that had been cut for his body alone. He sat at the head table without being guided there, which told you everything about his relationship with the concept of being guided. Adèle did what she always did. She kept moving. Bread rolls, water, the rehearsed invisible choreography of someone who has made invisibility into a professional art. She was reaching across to set the last wine glass at table 1, the head table, when it happened. The man seated to Duval's immediate left said something. She caught only the tail end of it, in Quebecois French so thick it was practically a separate language. Something about the service being slow. Something about the quality of establishments that hired without standards. And then Sébastien Duval looked at her, not the practiced non-look that most guests gave banquet staff, that particular form of erasure where your eyes move over a person the way they move over a lamp or a chair. He actually looked at her, and then he said something to the man beside him, in a voice low enough that it wasn't meant to carry past the table. It carried French, but not the French of the restaurant menus or the CBC, the French of somewhere specific, the patois of the lower parishes, the river towns, the places where the language had folded in on itself for 300 years and developed its own internal grammar. He said it quietly, almost pleasantly, the way you'd describe weather. He said that the help had gotten substantial. The table went quiet for the wrong reasons. Adèle felt it, the awful social stillness of people bracing themselves, not for violence, but for her reaction. The moment where everyone waits to see if the person who was just quietly gutted will have the grace to pretend they didn't hear. For exactly 3 seconds, the humiliation was physical. It moved from her ears to her chest to her hands. Her fingers tightened around the wineglass stem, and then something shifted. Not anger, exactly. Something older than anger. Something that had been sitting behind her sternum for a long time, in that same drawer with her father's letters, and had apparently been waiting for exactly this particular moment to decide it was done being filed away. She set the wineglass down, carefully, at the precise angle specified in the hotel's service manual. She straightened up, and she answered him. In the same French, not the CBC French, not the textbook French she'd learned in school, the real French, the river French, the language of the parishes along the South Shore, where her grand-mère had grown up, and where Adèle had spent every summer of her childhood until she was 12, listening to the old women talk on the gallery while they shelled peas. The French that Sébastien Duval had just used, assuming it was a private language. Assuming she wouldn't know it, she said, "My mother would say a man who measures his own size by cutting others down is working with a very short ruler. But I wouldn't know. I'm just the help." The accent was exact. The vowels were the vowels of the lower shore. The particular way the final consonant softened the rhythm of it. She had it the way you have something learned in childhood, before language becomes effort. The table went silent. Not the bracing silence from before. Something different. Something that had shape to it. Sébastien Duval did not move. He was a man who, by all available evidence, was never caught unprepared. He'd built an organization across 3 provinces on the fundamental principle that he always knew more than the other person in the room. He had people whose entire function was to make sure he was never surprised. He was surprised. His eyes hadn't left her. They were dark, not dramatically dark, just the brown of old wood of river water, and they were doing something she didn't have a word for, not anger, not amusement, something more careful than either. The man to his left started to say something. Duval raised one hand without looking away from Adèle. The man stopped. "Where are you from?" Duval said. "In French, in the same French." "Verdun," she said. "But my grand-mère was from Saint-Roch-des-Aulnays." Something moved across his face. Too fast to name. "Gagnon's territory," he said, almost to himself. It wasn't a question. "I wouldn't know about that," she said. She grew up beside the church and spent her Sundays arguing with the priest about the interpretation of Corinthians. That was her territory. For the first time in what felt like a very long evening, Sébastien Duval almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but the muscles around his eyes shifted in a way that suggested they remembered how. "The wine," he said, back to normal French now, the more standard register, like he was stepping down from something. She poured it. Her hand was steady. She was vaguely amazed by that. She finished service at table 1 and moved on to table 2, and she didn't look back, because she was a professional, and professionals don't look back, and also because some part of her understood that looking back right now would cost her something she hadn't calculated the price of yet. The first 90 minutes of the evening were uneventful by any external measure. Food service, cleared plates, the particular rhythm of a high-end banquet operating the way it was supposed to operate when everyone with authority in the room wanted it to go smoothly. She was in the service corridor, loading a tray with the dessert plates, tarte au sucre from a patisserie she could never afford to visit, when the corridor door opened. It wasn't Tanya. One of the suit men. Outer ring, she'd assessed him as, back when she'd been categorizing them instinctively the way you learn to do when you've worked rooms like this long enough. He held the door and said, with the elaborate courtesy of someone who was not asking, "Mr. Duval would like a word." There was a significant pause during which Adèle considered her options. They were limited. "I'm in the middle of dessert service," she said. "Your colleague can manage," the man said. Same tone. She looked at her tray. Then she set it down and followed him. The small anteroom off the north end of the ballroom had been converted into something between an office and a waiting area for the evening. A table, 2 chairs, a bottle of water nobody had touched. Sébastien Duval was standing at the window, looking out at the courtyard, where the snow had started falling in the way it does in Quebec City in November. Quietly, without drama, like it had been planning this for months, and saw no need to announce it now. He didn't turn around when she came in. "Close the door," he said. She did. There was a pause that she refused to fill. She'd learned that from years of banquet service. Never fill a powerful person's silence for them. It only makes you smaller. "Saint-Roch-des-Aulnays," he said, still facing the window. "I grew up 30 kilometers from there." She said nothing. "The church your grandmère argued at, Notre-Dame de Bonsecours?" "Oui." He turned around then. In the smaller space, he was more present, more simply there than he'd been at the head table. Something about the absence of an audience. "How old are you?" he said. 26. "You're working banquet service at 26. Someone has to," she said. "Unless you're suggesting the bread rolls arrange themselves." The almost smile again, closer this time. "You spoke back to me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like he was reading from a list of things that had happened, trying to make sure he had the facts straight. "You insulted me," she said, "in what I imagine you thought was a private language. Most people don't. Speak the dialect. Speak back." She looked at him evenly. "I know. I've been in service a long time. People like you say whatever they like about the staff because they've trained themselves to believe we're not really in the room. I'm tired of not being in the room." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Longer. Weighted differently. "Why Concordia?" he said. She stared at him. "Pardon? You said Verdun." "Concordia is the university most working-class Montrealers go to when they're going to university. Did you study there?" She was quiet for a moment. 2 years. Nursing. Before the money ran out. "And now you're in Quebec City." "My aunt had a contact at the hotel. The pay is better than Montreal service work. I send money home." She had no idea why she was telling him this, except that he had asked the questions with a directness that wasn't quite rude, and she had apparently inherited her grandmère's tendency to answer direct questions directly regardless of whether it was strategic. "What would you need?" he said slowly. "To go back?" She blinked. "Excuse me. To Concordia, or anywhere." "To finish. That's not." She stopped. Started again. "Why would you ask me that?" "I ask things I want to know the answer to," he said. "It's a habit. Then I'll tell you what I'd need. About $40,000 for tuition. A way to make rent in Montreal without working 60 hours a week. And some kind of guarantee that when I graduate, the healthcare system hasn't been defunded to the point where a nursing degree is decorative." She paused. But I don't think that's actually what you're asking. No, he agreed. It isn't. He walked to the table and sat down in the chair facing hers. Not the power move she'd expected, not remaining standing, not staying at the window with his back to her. He sat like someone settling in for a conversation they intended to take seriously. I have a problem, he said. I'm going to tell you what it is. You don't have to respond. I find that hard to believe, she said, given that you've been asking me questions for 5 minutes. He almost laughed. It was the closest he'd gotten. I have a property, he said, in the lower St. Lawrence region. A large one. It serves multiple purposes, some of which we won't discuss. It needs managing, not the financial side. I have people for that. The operational, day-to-day, logistics, the staff. It's a working property, it has guests, it has routines, and the woman who ran it for 14 years, retired 6 months ago, and nobody I've sent since, has lasted more than 3 weeks. Adèle looked at him. Why? Because they're afraid of me, he said, with a simplicity that was almost refreshing. Or they're trying to impress me. Both make them useless. What I need is someone who can run a household, manage a staff of 12, coordinate between departments that don't like each other, maintain standards under pressure, and do it without requiring my personal attention every 48 hours. She stared at him for a long moment. You're describing a job, she said. Yes, you're offering me a job. I'm describing one, he said carefully. Whether I'm offering it depends on what you say next. Adèle sat back slightly. She thought about Tanya in the service corridor, who would be managing dessert service alone right now, and would have notes about it later. She thought about her apartment, which was technically her aunt's cousin's second bedroom, and fit her bed and a dresser, and not much else. She thought about $40,000 and a nursing program, and a guarantee she'd been waiting 6 years to receive from a world that had not provided it. She thought about what her grand-mère would have said about sitting in a private room with a man like Sébastien Duval. The old woman had had opinions about everything, and had expressed them to everyone, including the priest, and had lived to 89 years old without once being less than exactly herself. I need the job to be real, she said. Actual salary, actual contract, actual legal employment. Not something I can't tell a lawyer about. It will be. I need to know what the property is. Not the parts we won't discuss. Those I understand. But the parts I'd be managing. A working estate, guest facilities, agricultural operations, staff housing 140 hectares in the lower shore. I need a trial period, she said. Mutual. Either of us can end it. Agreed. She looked at him steadily. And you need to understand what you said at that table tonight about the help. About substantial. That doesn't happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone on my staff. I don't care who's watching. The room was very quiet. Sébastien Duval looked at her across the table. Whatever had been working its way across his face all evening, that thing she hadn't had a word for, settled into something she could finally read. Respect. Not the tactical kind, not the kind you perform for an audience. The kind that costs something to give. It won't, he said. She nodded once. She reached over, picked up the bottle of water that nobody had touched, and poured 2 glasses. She set one in front of him. Then you have 30 days, she said. We'll see how we do. Outside the window, the snow kept falling over the old city. The river was out there somewhere past the lights, wide and dark and cold, not caring about any of it. But in the small anteroom off the north end of the Versailles Ballroom, something had shifted. The way pressure shifts before weather changes, subtle enough that you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. Adèle Prudhomme had spent 4 years learning to be invisible in rooms that didn't deserve her. She didn't think she'd be doing that much longer.